I, Sinue the Egyptian, write this. In my place of exile on the shores of the Red Sea, there is no more desolate spot on earth. Soon the jackals and the vultures will make a poor meal of what is left of me. No monument will mark my resting place. I will leave only this, the story of my life.
Think being an Egyptian priest meant power and luxury? Think again. Their lives were a never-ending nightmare of razor-sharp rituals, deadly secrets, and psychological torture, all hidden behind golden temple walls. According to temple inscriptions and ancient manuals, these holy men shaved every hair on their bodies daily, lived under strict rules about sex and food, and constantly feared punishment or even execution for the smallest mistake. This wasn't just devotion. It was a system built to control every part of their lives, right down to their thoughts and bodies. And while the temples looked like paradise from the outside, the reality inside was much darker. Inside those temple walls, everything ran on a strict chain of command. The hierarchy was brutal, and unless you were born into the right family, you were stuck at the bottom for life. The lowest rank, the Wab priests, handled all the grunt work, cleaning, carrying offerings, and guarding the temple through endless nights. Temple archives show these men sometimes served marathon festival duties that stretched across several weeks, with records describing exhaustion so severe that some priests collapsed during ceremonies. Most never rose above this level, their names lost to time, their daily grind barely acknowledged by the temple's official history. If you managed to climb higher, things didn't get much easier. Lector priests had to memorize sacred texts word for word, with no room for mistakes. Slip up during a ritual, and you risked demotion or worse. The Hora priests, meanwhile, were responsible for tracking ritual time using star charts. If they missed the right moment, it wasn't just a scheduling error. It was seen as an insult to the gods, with the blame falling squarely on their shoulders. At the top of the pyramid sat the high priests of Amun, the elite few who controlled vast estates, collected taxes, and even commanded armies. But even they walked a tightrope. During the New Kingdom, high priests often found themselves in power struggles with the pharaohs. There's an inscription at Karnak Temple where one high priest boasts about divining the king's fate, a not-so-subtle threat to royal authority. Some of these high priests vanished after such moves. The temple records fall silent, but the message is clear. The system was set up to keep everyone in their place. Junior priests slept in cramped barracks, sometimes working through festival stints that lasted as long as 36 hours straight, as one priest's diary from Deir el-Medina complains. Meanwhile, the high priests relaxed in shaded palanquins. The differences were obvious, and so were the resentments. Money didn't guarantee comfort either. Temple account tablets tell us about priests like Pentahunaktu, who had to borrow silver just to buy the sacred leopard skin required for rituals, then spent years paying it back. Falling into debt for ritual gear was common among mid-level priests, and there was little hope of climbing out. For every priest who made it to the top, countless others wore themselves down with endless kneeling, back-breaking chores and debts they could never repay. Even the lucky ones rarely saw true rewards. And if you think the hierarchy was harsh, just wait until you learn what they had to do every single day just to be considered pure. What counted as pure in ancient Egypt would make a modern-day germaphobe look lazy. Every day started long before dawn with a ritual that would break most people. Priests had to shave every single hair from their bodies, head, eyebrows, even eyelashes, using bronze razors that pulled more than they cut. Ritual manuals spelled it out. Leave a single hair and you risked losing your job. This wasn't about looking good. It was about proving you were worthy to stand before the gods. Bathing was just as relentless. Ritual texts prescribed multiple daily immersions in sacred pools where priests scrubbed themselves raw with natron salt. The water wasn't just for hygiene. It was supposed to reset the universe's balance. Ritual texts warned that impurity could unleash chaos, and if a priest skipped a wash, he could be blamed for anything from a bad harvest to a plague. The pressure wasn't just social, it was cosmic. Clothing rules added another layer of stress. Priests wore only spotless white linen. No leather, no wool, nothing with even a hint of animal origin. If a stain appeared or a sandal strap broke mid-ritual, the priest had to undergo new rounds of purification. Archaeologists have found temple records describing how even minor blemishes on clothing triggered extra rituals. It wasn't about fashion, it was about keeping every detail perfect. Food was just as tightly controlled. No fish, no beans, no garlic. Anything that might offend the god's senses was off limits. Meat had to be from temple sacrifices and ritually blessed before a priest could eat it. Even a small mistake, like eating food that hadn't been purified, could mean banishment from the temple. The rules were so strict that priests sometimes starved themselves rather than risk breaking them. And then there was the constant surveillance. Temple doorkeepers inspected every priest for stubble, sweat, or chipped nails before ceremonies. Fail an inspection, and you'd be assigned the most humiliating chores. Workers graffiti at Edfu Temple jokes about a priest caught with a 5 o'clock shadow who ended up cleaning statues all month. All of this took a toll. Medical papyri describe priests suffering from anxiety, hair loss, and insomnia. Symptoms we'd recognize today as stress disorders. Some even resorted to herbal remedies just to get through the day. The obsession with purity wasn't about personal devotion. It was a system designed to keep priests on edge, always afraid of slipping up. But the real test came during the rituals themselves, where the smallest mistake could bring disaster, not just for the priest, but for the entire community. When it came to temple rituals, the margin for error was razor thin. Ancient Egyptian ceremonies demanded absolute precision, not just in movement, but in words, timing, and even breath. Lector priests memorized endless lines of hymns and had to recite them flawlessly while performing complicated steps in exact order. Ritual manuals and temple inscriptions spell out the consequences. Forget a line, stumble on a word, or move at the wrong moment, and you didn't just embarrass yourself, you risked severe punishment. Records show that corporal punishment for ritual mistakes was common, sometimes leading to lifetime bans from temple service. Even a minor slip could mean exile from your community, with your name scrubbed from temple lists. Mistakes didn't just ruin a career, they were blamed for disasters. Egyptians believed that a botched ritual could unleash chaos, bad harvests, plagues, or even attacks from hostile neighbors. When things went wrong, temple scribes combed through ritual records, hunting for the smallest error. Legal codes of the time prescribed capital punishment for priests found responsible for major calamities, and temple archives describe harsh penalties after natural disasters that were pinned on ritual mistakes. If the Nile flooded late or famine struck, the search for a scapegoat began. Sometimes priests accused of such failures were paraded through the streets with signs declaring them abominations, then exiled or worse. The pressure to get everything right was crushing. One priest's diary from Deir el-Medina talks about hands shaking so badly during rituals that he could barely hold the sacred tools. Another account describes a lector priest developing a stutter from constant stress, forced to communicate only in writing. After a mistake, purification rituals could be brutal. Days of fasting and isolation, reciting penitential prayers in the dark. Some priests emerged unable to speak or work, broken by the ordeal. Even the highest ranks weren't immune. A stela at Abydos records a high priest of Osiris demoted to tomb cleaner after a sacred animal died on his watch. His successor didn't last long before being accused of breathing impurely during a rite and sent to a remote posting. In some years, the high priest's position changed hands so often that temple records simply stopped listing names, as if admitting the job was cursed. The constant threat of failure turned temple life into a minefield of suspicion. Junior priests spied on each other, hoping to earn favor by reporting mistakes first. At Edfu Temple, a wall carving shows two Wab priests tattling on their superior for scratching his nose during a ceremony. He got reassigned to cleaning crocodile pens, while the informers enjoyed extra rations, at least until they were reported for whispering during prayers a few weeks later. Living under this kind of scrutiny, priests developed routines to double and triple check every move. They counted steps, rehearsed lines into polished copper mirrors, and fasted before rituals to avoid stomach noises. Medical texts from Saqqara describe priests suffering from ulcers and trembling hands. One prescription even calls for honey and cannabis to steady nerves before offerings. But if you think surviving the rituals was tough, just wait until you see what happened when temple politics got involved. Temple treasuries in ancient Egypt weren't just about sacred relics. They held enough grain to feed entire towns and gold that could sway the economy of a kingdom. At Karnak Temple, records mention tens of thousands of workers relying on priestly grain handouts. With that kind of wealth, temples became centers of power, and wherever there's power, there's always a fight to control it. Pharaohs and high priests clashed constantly. The Amun priesthood in Thebes, for example, ended up controlling nearly a third of Egypt's farmland by the time of Ramses III. When the pharaoh tried to audit their accounts, the high priest supposedly sent an oracle saying Amun disapproved. Some Egyptologists debate whether this played a role in Ramses III's eventual assassination. His name was erased from temple records, and receipts show the plotters made hefty donations to Amun's temple just before the coup. It's the kind of story that makes you wonder who really ran the country. Akhenaten's reign is a case study in what happens when a pharaoh tries to break the priesthood's grip. He abruptly shut down many temples and, according to the Amarna letters, dismissed thousands of priests overnight. The fallout was brutal. Texts from Amarna describe former temple staff left destitute. But when Akhenaten died, the old priesthood returned with a vengeance. They erased his name from monuments and, according to temple records, even arranged the murder of his successor, Tutankhamun's vizier Ai, during a religious ceremony. The message couldn't be clearer: cross the priesthood and nobody is safe. Priestly corruption was legendary. A papyrus from Deir el-Medina accuses priests of skimming most of the temple beer rations. Another from Memphis details how priests claimed sacred statues needed repairs, then pocketed the gold. When Pharaoh Sobekotep IV tried to investigate, the priests produced a prophecy warning the Nile would flood early if he kept pushing. Sure enough, the Nile rose, after the priests secretly opened upstream gates. Even low-ranking priests got caught in the fallout. During Ramses XI's reign, a temple corruption scandal in Thebes ended with 200 priests arrested for everything from selling mummy wrappings to faking prophecies. Sentences included forced labor in the turquoise mines, a virtual death sentence. Meanwhile, the high priest behind the scheme got promoted. Temple politics could turn violent fast. One high priest at Heliopolis had a rival sealed alive inside a ritual crypt. Another, at Abydos, retired his predecessor by arranging a fatal accident during a purification rite. Temple murals still show workers chiseling out the victim's name mid-ceremony. When foreign rulers took over, they didn't bother with subtlety. The Persians impaled dozens of priests on temple gates for treason. Some Greek accounts report Macedonian soldiers desecrated sacred texts when they seized Memphis. By Cleopatra's time, high priest jobs often went to political allies instead of the clergy. Survival meant knowing who to trust and who to betray. Priests kept blackmail material on each other, like the cache of love letters found under Abydos temple's floor. Reporting a colleague for minor mistakes could mean a promotion. One lector priest lost his job over the wrong shade of temple paint, thanks to a rival's complaint. Many priests hated the constant scheming, but had no way out. Leaving the temple meant losing all protection. Court records mention former priests sued for debts or accused of theft. One demoted priest's suicide note at Edfu reads, "The God has eaten my heart." But for those who stayed, the real danger wasn't just politics. Some secrets carried a price far higher than exile or disgrace. In ancient Egypt, priests didn't just guard the temple doors, they guarded knowledge that could ruin lives. Some secrets were so closely held that even mentioning them outside the right circle meant serious consequences. Edfu temple texts warn of severe penalties for priests who revealed hidden spells or rituals to outsiders. It wasn't just about keeping power, it was about keeping dangerous information from slipping into the wrong hands. Medical knowledge was especially risky. The Ebers and Smith papyri are packed with surgical procedures, remedies, and diagnoses. But these weren't open textbooks. Medical priests risked harsh punishments, sometimes even death, for teaching their craft outside the temple. Archaeologists have found punitive burials that show signs of brutal treatment for priests who broke the rules. Even basic astronomy was a minefield. Predicting eclipses or tracking the stars too accurately made pharaohs nervous, especially if a priest's calculations hinted at royal misfortune. Some priests who crossed that line vanished from temple records overnight. The mental burden of holding forbidden knowledge was enormous. Lector priests had to memorize vast collections of secret texts, then act like they'd never heard of them. One diary from Karnak describes a priest waking up shouting sacred words, with his colleagues scrambling to silence him before anyone else heard. There are stories of priests inventing elaborate rituals just to cope, like the high priest in Memphis who used disappearing ink so he wouldn't accidentally leave secrets lying around. Foreign spies and rival powers were always looking for a way in. When Hittite agents bribed a priest for temple blueprints, Ramses II's officials interrogated the entire priesthood at Pi-Ramesses. Several priests confessed under torture and paid with their lives. Later, Persian invaders offered huge rewards for a single page from the Amduat or other funerary texts, only to kill the priest who handed it over. These texts weren't just religious, they contained instructions for navigating the afterlife, and messing them up was said to have deadly consequences. Tomb inscriptions warn of entire burial parties struck down after a ritual went wrong, and some papyri blame mysterious deaths on priests who recited spells incorrectly. Security around these secrets was intense. Some temples used scribes who worked blindfolded, copying dangerous texts without ever seeing the full content. At Edfu, the most valuable scrolls were kept in underground vaults guarded by crocodiles and traps. Priests in Heliopolis used hand signs to communicate secret formulas, refusing to speak them aloud even in private. All this secrecy took a toll. Medical texts from Deir el-Bahri describe priests suffering from knowledge sickness, sweating, shaking, and even losing their minds from the stress of keeping so many secrets. One remedy involved drinking until you forgot what you knew. A faded papyrus from Abydos lists more than a dozen priest suicides blamed on the weight of the sacred. And if you think all that pressure was bad, wait until you see what happened when it came to their personal lives, because even love and desire were strictly off limits. Celibacy and sexual repression weren't just rules, they were the invisible walls of a priest's life. Egyptian society openly celebrated fertility, with temples covered in erotic art and gods who had legendary affairs. But for the men running those temples, the rules flipped. Most priests faced strict abstinence before entering sacred spaces, usually 3 days according to temple records. For elite groups like the priests of Ptah, the expectation stretched to extended periods, sometimes even years, of celibacy. Medical texts from Deir el-Medina mention potions to cool the blood and stone beds designed to keep desire at bay. Enforcement was relentless. At Karnak, temple guards checked bed sheets for evidence of forbidden activity. A papyrus from Abydos records a priest demoted to latrine duty because his wife became pregnant during a purification cycle. Even married priests spent long stretches living like strangers, no shared meals, no contact, sometimes for months at a time. Archaeologists found a love letter at Saqqara where a priest's wife pleads, "Must I forever be a widow to a living man?" The rules didn't care about feelings. The toll showed up everywhere. Medical scrolls describe priests with what we now call depression and anxiety, and the Ebers Papyrus actually recommends a potion to suppress sexual desire for those struggling with persistent thoughts. At Kam Ombo, scratched drawings of women in storage rooms hint at years of isolation. The need for intimacy didn't just vanish, it went underground. Priests lived with daily irony. They led fertility festivals where commoners celebrated openly in temple courtyards, blessed marriages, and anointed statues of gods known for their passions. Meanwhile, their own marriages faded in the background. One satirical papyrus from the reign of Ramses II shows a priest watching lovers embrace, the caption reading, "The god sees all and feels nothing." Even humor couldn't hide the contradictions. Cross the line and the penalties were severe. Legal codes from the late period describe punishments for sexual infractions ranging from public shaming to permanent exile from temple life. There's no shortage of graffiti and court records warning that priests who broke the rules rarely got a second chance. Some developed obsessive behaviors, like the priest at Edfu who washed his hands raw whenever a woman passed by. The result? A priesthood that was supposed to embody life and fertility, but lived in a constant state of denial. Medical scans of priestly mummies show high rates of stress fractures and jaw tension, the physical marks of years spent holding everything in. The contradiction between public ritual and private repression left scars that went far beyond the body. And if trying to control every desire wasn't enough, priests also had to step into the sandals of the gods themselves, sometimes literally. The psychological strain of priestly life went far beyond strict rules and physical hardship. Imagine waking up as an ordinary man and by midday being expected to act as the living embodiment of a god. During major festivals, priests didn't just honor Horus or Set, they performed rituals that made them stand-ins for the gods themselves. Temple inscriptions describe days of preparation, fasting, chanting, and covering themselves in pigments to mimic divine skin. Some rituals even involved psychoactive substances, according to medical papyri, to help priests enter altered states. One account from Thebes mentions a priest whose eyes stayed dilated for days after performing as Amun. The effects were more than physical. There are personal diaries and medical notes that mention hallucinations and mental breakdowns after intense ceremonies. The opening of the mouth ritual at Edfu Temple, for example, required priests to channel a deity's presence into a statue. If it worked, the statue was said to come alive. If it didn't, the priest sometimes suffered sleeplessness, paranoia, or even delusions. One diary from Abydos describes a priest terrified by the sensation that a statue of Anubis blinked at him, a moment likely caused by exhaustion and lack of sleep. Rituals weren't just performances, they were believed to keep the universe running. Priests thought their words and actions kept the sun moving and chaos at bay. A single mistake during the daily repelling chaos ceremony was seen as a threat to the world itself. Temple logs from Karnak mention priests collapsing from exhaustion, and stories circulate of lector priests breaking down in tears after forgetting a line. The pressure to be perfect was relentless. Identity blurred over time. High-ranking priests took on god names, erasing their old identities during temple service. Losing rank meant losing that divine persona. One letter from Memphis describes a former high priest begging just to hear his god name again. The request was denied. Some late priests confessed in their writings that they no longer knew where their own identity ended and the gods began. The toll showed up in their bodies. CT scans of priestly mummies reveal signs of chronic stress, teeth worn from grinding, hair loss, and even skeletal deformities from ritual practices. By the end, some priests tried to cope with simple routines, counting stones, focusing on their breathing, anything to ground themselves. But for many, the line between human and divine grew so thin that it was hard to tell where one stopped and the other began. And while priests struggled to hold their world together, forces outside the temple were quietly working to erase them from history. The end of Egypt's priesthood wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a slow, grinding erasure led by foreign rulers and changing times. When the Persians took over in 525 BCE, they didn't just march in and smash statues. Instead, they gutted the priesthood's power by slashing salaries, stripping temple lands, and sending priests into forced labor. High priests who pushed back found themselves shipped off to the copper mines or quietly replaced. The message was clear. The days of priests running the show were over. The Greeks, under Ptolemy I, kept the temples open but changed the rules. Suddenly, foreign priests, often with little knowledge of Egyptian rituals, were in charge. Local papyri complain about new high priests who couldn't read hieroglyphs and treated sacred ceremonies like office paperwork. Traditional priests were pushed aside, reduced to performing rituals for tourists or acting as guides for curious visitors. One bit of graffiti at Edfu even mocks an elderly priest, calling him the human relic. The old guard watched their traditions get hollowed out from the inside. Then came the Romans, who made it personal. Augustus paraded Cleopatra's priest through the streets and flogged him for supposed treason. Temple lands were seized and handed to Roman veterans, and priests were ordered to conduct rituals in Latin. A fragment from a Karnak priest's diary sums it up. "Today I butchered the words of the gods before laughing soldiers." Resistance didn't end well. Priests who tried to hide sacred texts or defy Roman orders faced brutal reprisals, including exile, public shaming, or worse. The erasure wasn't just political, it was physical. Pharaohs like Akhenaten had already set a precedent by deleting entire priesthoods from monuments and temple walls. Later, at Amarna, workers chiseled out not just names, but whole scenes of priests at work. Even burials weren't safe. Archaeologists at Saqqara have found priestly tombs with faces scratched off sarcophagi, a final insult meant to erase their memory. Christianity sealed the deal. As the new faith spread, the last pagan priests became little more than curiosities. 4th century travelers describe white-robed priests of Isis performing bits of ritual for coins, while the Oracle of Amun gave fortunes to passing sailors. At Philae Temple, the last known hieroglyph is a priest's desperate plea to Isis, soon overwritten by Christian crosses. Later travelers recorded that temples recycled mummy remains for building materials, a far cry from the old days of sacred burials. Modern excavations show how complete the purge was. At Abydos, a priest's library was found with every writing palette smashed. In Thebes, storage rooms were filled with broken ritual vessels. Even the language died out. Demotic script vanished so thoroughly that it baffled scholars for centuries. When the last priestly families faded away, all that remained were scraps. A story of a man in Luxor charging tourists to watch him make the god move by yanking a statue's strings, a few battered texts, and memories no one could read. Their temples became quarries, their rituals became superstition, and their names faded into dust. So there you have it, the truth behind the golden masks. These priests spent their lives obeying impossible rules, carrying cosmic burdens, and living in fear, all for the privilege of serving gods who never protected them. Their temple shone on the outside, but inside, their daily reality was darker than any tomb. So next time you complain about your morning routine, remember the ancient priests, shaving head to toe, starving through purification fasts, and knowing that one mistake could doom everyone around them. Their authority chained them more tightly than common laborers. Let me know in the comments which part of their lives shocked you the most, and maybe take a second to appreciate just how easy modern life really is.